I'm going to walk through BEAD, a little bit on BEAD, why BEAD, the rationale behind BEAD, the rationale behind government funding, and then walk into what happened in Louisiana. Louisiana is the first state out the door with their BEAD process. I believe their process worked well. Hopefully you'll see that in the results. There's some surprising participants. There's good participation, so we'll walk through all that. So first, why is there need for government funding? And we've heard it over the last couple days. Gary mentioned it yesterday that AT&T is doing wireless first in a good portion of their footprint because the number of subscribers per density is so low that the economics just do not make sense from a commercial standpoint. You're not going to get your funds back from the investment in the area. So with that in mind, how do you do that? And in the past, when AT&T was the only company out there and they were required to provide voice service out there, the system was a cross-subsidization. Rural customers were funded by urban customers, residential customers were funded by business customers, and the whole rate structure is built that way, and everybody was happy. They got broke up, we entered competition, Charter came along, just ruined the whole party because they provided competition that took the high margin customers, which then forced the inability to fund the high cost customers. So that's where government steps in. So this first chart, and I'm using Florida not because we're in Florida, but because I did this slide for an assessor conference I did in December. What you see here is just the general investment required across the state of Florida. And the important thing is the scale down there that you see. When I talk to providers, they typically say, we will deploy in areas where the typical cost per home pass is about $1,500, give or take. And when we look at the economics, you could potentially go up to about $2,500 if you have an area that is basically unserved and you can get a high take rate. So you can see here that 0 to 1,500 is the light green, mainly around cities across Florida, which makes sense. The higher density, you're going to make money, and the lower investment. You then start getting into the dark green, the yellow, and the red are areas where no one will make money on the investment. My general rule of thumb, and I've said this before, is you take the CapEx, you multiply it by 0.02%. That's the amount of revenue that you need on a monthly basis to make that make sense. So when you're at $3,000 and you had 100% take rate, you need about $60 a month in revenue to cover that. But when you have competition, you don't have 100% take rate. If you only get a third of the customers, you're now at $180 of revenue to make that business case work out. So I think we heard it from Joan this morning that typically the first provider in a market makes out well. Second provider, maybe. Third provider, you're starting to get down in take rates that just make it inefficient because the number of customers that you have to pay off the investment drops. So when you're at $35,000 plus, and there are many locations across the country at that point and above, you're talking $700 per home passed of revenue to make that worthwhile. You're never going to get that. Anybody pay $700? Anybody in the crowd? No, no one does. And you're not going to get that. And that assumes 100% take rate. I put this up here because it's just a nice, pretty pie chart. You know, it's three-dimensional. But the point of this is, one, the big cost components of running fiber is this blue piece here, which is the drop to your home. Drop to your home typically runs anywhere from about $400 to, we've had some providers sell $1,500 per home. But that's about 15% of the cost of a typical deployment. The next biggest part is the distribution plan, which makes up almost 50% of the investment. This is the plant that runs down your neighborhood, down the streets, and is the required component. It's the last mile to your house. I won't go through the rest, but it just gives you a kind of a breakout that you can use. We now flip to the economic value of the network. The first one was how much capital it would cost to deploy. But capital is not only one component. You have to operate the network. You have to replace the components of the network over time. So you have to look at the business case. This is the business case that we ran for Florida, and we run it on a per location basis. So it's the net present value of a business case over 20 years. We chose 20 years because the average life of fiber is potentially about 25 to 30. Average life of the electronics is maybe 7 to 8. But when you look at that fiber, that's the biggest portion of the investment. So you're really looking at what is the lifetime investment and business case of that. So we ran 20 years. And what you see here is the green areas are profitable from our viewpoint. Any other color on that chart is questionable. And this is at a 70% take rate. So you can imagine if there's competition introduced, the green, a lot of the green will go away. When you think about the components of that business case over 20 years, half of it is made up of the capital side, the depreciation on the plant, the cost of money, the taxes associated with that cost of money. That is half of the cost of that business case. If you start increasing the amount of investment per customer, that portion of the pie gets bigger. So we know there are areas of the country that need intervention. We know the monopoly went away and the government has stepped in. We had CAF, which was the Connect America Fund, started out. That then evolved into CAF2, which evolved into RDOF, which we've got enhanced ACAM and ACAM, all these fund programs from the FCC to help fund that. So let me walk you through Florida. What amount of funding has Florida received to build out broadband? And the table you see here, you can grab this table off the FCC's National Broadband Funding Map. You've probably heard of the National Broadband Map, which gives you coverage, but there's a compendium map associated with that, which gives you all the locations in the country that have been funded with federal funds, with the exception of CAF2 money is not in here. But you can see across the blend, $209 million has been spent on Florida to expand broadband for 120,000 locations. It's about $1,800 per location has been spent. Florida got an additional $1.17 billion to spend. Florida is running kind of at the end. Texas and Florida working through challenges to try and get this set up, but they will get it there, but they've got a good chunk of money to spend. When I get to Louisiana, Louisiana had $1.4 billion in their program. So let me now transition into BEAD. So BEAD, as Joan mentioned, is a $42 billion program administered by the states. In part, the administration by the states was the fact that people viewed RDOF as a failure. So states are pushing for what is called grants. Louisiana ran a competitive grant process. You say potato, I say potato, they say auctions, they say competitive grants. It's, you're trying to get some economic push into those areas to try and drive effective outcomes. So this is the BEAD process. The states went through their challenge process in which they took the FCC coverage, they took it down to the state level, they took it out to the neighborhoods, the communities, and said, challenge us to tell us what's served and unserved. That's the end result of the challenge process. All 56 state and territory entities have completed that. Once you had that done, you then filed your volume 2, or volume 2 was filed in the process. Once your volume 2 was approved, volume 2 is the general rules of how you'll run your grant process, how it'll be monitored. Once that is approved, the states have 1 year in which to run the grant program and then file their final proposal back to NTIA. Louisiana just had their final proposal approved 2 weeks ago. Their program started back in December of 2024, or whatever years, 2023. They filed their final proposal in December of last year, it just finally got approved. But you have a year to do that. The year covers your pre-qualification, so They wanted to correct some of the issues with RDOF. Participants in the program have to have a letter of credit, meet other conditions to participate in these programs, and that's the pre-qualification. And then you run your subgrantee selection. And then once you're done, you file your final proposal. The parties have 4 years to build. So John mentioned yesterday about RDOF. RDOF had a 6-year build-out period. BEAD has a 4-year build-out period. So now Louisiana, and some of you have seen this. I presented some of this at in Wichita for the property tax people in the room. Basically, what Louisiana did is they carved up their state. They had 140,000 locations qualify for the BEAD program. They asked us to come up with project areas or sub-project areas for bid. The sub-project areas are what Louisiana did is they said, we're not going to define the project area. We're going to define these subunits. You put the subunits together in the bid package you think is most reasonable, and you file that. They asked us to come up with the sub-project areas. We did. We came up with 1,850 of these for the 140,000 locations. What we tried to do is match wireline engineering. To me, BEAD used census blocks, and I've got a picture. People have seen it. The problem with census blocks is census blocks are road defined. So a census block will have census block left on one side of the road, a different census block on the right side of the road. What happened in RDOF is a census block got awarded out. Lo and behold, we come into BEAD. The other side of the road is now eligible for BEAD and part of the program. It's an oddity, but it happens a lot. And that's what we saw when we came into Louisiana is we wanted to avoid that. And the ability to avoid that is because we now have location level data. The FCC didn't have that for RDOF. So we ran clusters, kind of road-based clusters that we thought from a fiber builder perspective, it would make sense for them to bid on the area. But we also identified little outlier points that the cluster, the sub-project area only has 1 or 2 points in it. And that's because these points are 2, 3, 5, 10 miles out in the middle of a bayou. And you don't want to burden another project area with that point because 1, it discourages bidding. 2, it inflates the investment required in the area. The other thing Louisiana did, and some states are not doing this, is Louisiana said, this is the amount of money we're going to offer in this area. They said, this is the economic value that we perceive for it. You bid according to that. You can bid below it. You can bid twice it, no more than twice. You will get scored on the criteria, and I'll show you, of how close you are to the Louisiana target value. So in that way, Louisiana knew going in, they could afford the program. They knew going in kind of the expected budget that would be spent. So it was a benefit to them, and they knew going in that they would give providers a signal of this is the expectation. I'm not saying providers would go above that if it wasn't signaled. I wouldn't say providers would go and bid higher if it was unconstrained, but they do. It's the natural fact of an open process in which you can claim funds. If you're not given the incentive to go in efficiently, there's an expectation that the numbers will be higher. And this was one way for them to do that is these are the expectations we have. In the scoring, so these are what the project areas look like. The green or the coloring that you see up here is we used hex cells as the smallest unit. So a small hex cell is 200 meters on a side. And then we identified all the points within those hex cells. And then we clustered. So the colors that you see up there is the clusters of the hex cells that we created for the sub-project areas. And then you can see the scoring. The biggest component of scoring was 300 points, and that was how you bid based upon that reference funding amount. So if you really bid efficiently, you'd get a lot of points. The one thing that Louisiana has done that other states are not is they tied in mobility into this program. They wanted to close the gap of the unserved 5G areas within the state. So they targeted certain spas in the state as critical resource need spas, that if you've been in this area and you said you would build out the wireless infrastructure, you got additional points. And that additional points was 100 points. And this is where T-Mobile came in, and where the consortium figured out not the game of the system, but how to leverage T-Mo's ability to come in as a party to improve their ability to win. And you'll see that in the results that I show. So this is the end result. So I'm going to start at the end and then come backwards. So of the 140,000 locations, 95% were awarded out as fiber. Very successful project. This fiber first concept, Louisiana pushed it to the hilt with that. 2% on fixed wireless, 1% on cable. We'll talk about that. It's kind of humorous. I've been told I'm not allowed to mention the company name, but no, we'll talk about it. And it wasn't John, not John. So, and then we have Leo. And in the Leo in Louisiana is kind of that cleanup player. When New York ran their auction 5 years ago, they used geostationary satellite as their cleanup service provider for those that just didn't go out economically. Louisiana held those out, and then are still in discussions with Starlink and Kuiper on which one will get it. I've not yet heard who in their final proposal. They just had a target value in there, and they're still in the negotiations. You know, the expectation is it will likely go to Starlink from a political perspective, in my view. I talked about the 1.35 billion that they had. In the deployment program, 56% will go out. So they've got 43% of the funds left for non-deployment projects. And there have been parties that said, why don't you just return that? And there's a push, but these are obligated funds, and the state has plans for that 43%. So it's going to be a hard pullback of that money. Because what parties have said is, if you've got excess, why don't you ship it out to those states that will face pressure to get to 100% coverage? So these are the results that came out. Average investment per location, or average funding, $5,300. To me, a very good program. When you look at what Nevada did with Project Kuiper, they're providing about $3,000 per location to Project Kuiper from Amazon. When we were pulling this together, I've heard numbers from Starlink anywhere from about 4,500 to over 10,000 per location. So if you can get fiber at $5,300 per average location as compared to a satellite service, does it make sense? And that's the question. At what point does it not make sense to invest in fiber? What additional benefit in fiber do you look at? Is it a 1 time, 2 times, 3 times the cost of satellite where you set your ceiling? And that's what's up to states. States have to determine what that maximum level of funding we will use for fiber deployment. But you can see the cable coax came in at 519 locations. Their investment was 2,000. It was the lowest. And that's because most of it is just an extension, small extension outside their footprint, or filling in the gaps within their footprint. So it's a very efficient deployment for them. These are the list of winners. You can see the Louisiana Local Fiber Consortium was at the top. That is the T-Mobile consortium with 2 local Louisiana fiber providers. T-Mobile is going to fulfill the wireless component of the bids and work with these providers. I'm I'm guessing, on the backhaul access for these towers, along with additional towers in the state. And I'll show you what that footprint that they won. But that was a surprise, I think, to many parties, that a single party was able to gather or gain more than 50% the total that was awarded out, which was $748 million. And part of that is the ability, these state grant things are complex. The rules are complex. You need a team that is capable and understands kind of this competitive grant process to understand where you can get benefit. And they identified the benefit of tagging in T-Mobile to get that extra 100 points on their proposals, that they were able to win so much. But you can see AT&T competed, won 20,000 locations at 54 million. The humorous thing to me was Comcast won 200 locations. I mean, in part, it's not an onerous program, but it's a program in which there's monitoring that you have to do for 5, 10, 15 years on these projects. Is it really worth 750,000? You do notice that Charter is not in this list, as John said yesterday. Charter is trying to stay out of the BEAD process. Their experience with RDOF has been good to date. So good. Atlanta's Cox's hometown. So, but you can see the wide variety of participants in here. The fixed wireless provider, that the biggest one was Skyrider, I think, or Allen's. I forget which ones of these are the wireless. I think Pelican Broadband is wireless. Faster Cajun is a wireless, I think. But those in Louisiana, and the way the programs run is fiber gets priority first before you start to consider the alternative technologies. So fixed wireless in Louisiana, they did not use the extremely high cost threshold that they're allowed to use to create that cutoff point. They just ran this with a point of trying to maximize fiber, and then where fiber wasn't there and there's a fixed wireless provider, that grant went out to the fixed wireless. Yeah.
Funding per BSL, and that's the amount of the grant
per location.
They also publish the information on the company.
So Louisiana, in that the carriers didn't have to specify their match, but per the BEAD rules, the carriers have to match 25%. So with that 5,000, the carrier's going to have to put in about $1,200 on their own. So the total project cost may be 7,000. They're going to get the 5,800 from that for the area. We are now seeing where some providers are asking for waivers. Waivers are allowed in the BEAD process that you don't have to match. So waiver requests are starting to flow in because they feel that these funds aren't reasonable, that they need less of their money and more of the government money to play the role. That will be contentious as we move forward in these BEAD programs. How much of those match waivers are granted by NTIA as we move through the process? John.
So the 748, just as a reminder, a couple slides ago, you said total BEAD funding for Louisiana was
1.35. Yeah, so the remaining amount is about 600 million for alternative non-deployment projects. So one of them is they're going to use the funds to map all the underground infrastructure in the state of Louisiana, including broadband, so that they can make sure there's no construction issues. When they go out and trench a street, all that information is known. Virginia is using some of their non-deployment funds to actually do a 5G fund. So Virginia will be announcing their 5G program soon. They're going to use 200 or 300 million of their non-deployment for 5G. So now let me walk you back through the process. So these are the sub-project areas. As I said earlier, there was 1,853. Average count of BSLs per SPA was 75. We targeted in our clustering about 400, knowing that we get about an average much lower just because of the sparse nature. This is like a shotgun blast of which locations are available. I could show you the swamps in Louisiana. There are many locations in the swamps that there are structures. They're considered BSLs by the FCC and are awarded out. And we tried to make sure that those were separated from other ones because access to those are from specialized providers. But you can see the distribution of points. We had 843 of them had less than 5. 981 less than 10. So there are just a lot of single points in the state of Louisiana that are up for bid. And those are the highest cost ones. This is just what those spas look like in the northern part of Louisiana. And again, it's a shotgun blast. It's basically take shotgun blast up there, and that's what you see as the unserved locations in the state of Louisiana, which makes sense. It's the rural parts of the state, and these are density areas that are very low dense, and those locations are separated out quite a bit. The southern half of the state, these are the areas. There are no roads down here. I mean, it is swamp, and the way to get to it is with your airboat. We're not, I haven't looked back at who bid and won on that. I think it was a fixed wireless provider. It might have been Starlink. Yeah, Gary. When the FCC map was produced for the allocation, there were over 300,000 locations identified as and underserved in the state of Louisiana. The issue is when it went through the challenge process, that got reduced to 140,000. Part of that is when the FCC and NTI developed the RDOF allocation formula, they said exclude RDOF. So RDOF was pulled out of the pre-process to determine the allocation. The build out is post RDOF because they don't want to duplicate the funding to a location. So those states that had heavy participation in RDOF basically benefited from that allocation exercise because part of the unserved locations are funded by a separate federal program. Yeah, so it was an issue. We helped NTI and the NOFO. And the issue with RDOF in the allocation was parties were unsure of the impact of all the defaults that occurred. Starlink was still being considered because Starlink was awarded RDOF, but they weren't quite sure. Well, it gets to the point that Starlink isn't considered a reliable technology in BEAD. So how do you count that? It's the same with the fixed wireless providers in RDOF that won. They're not considered a reliable technology and were excluded. So it was that whole conceptual process of how do you account for it. So they chose to allocate before BEAD and then fund based after BEAD. Some of the issues, though, is with RDOF funding. I think in RDOF funding, if it was a fixed wireless provider, unlicensed fixed wireless, I think it may have been excluded, but I'll have to go back and check. I can't remember right offhand, but we can check that.
On the challenge process, there was no mechanism in place because it was an allocation. It was like Louisiana's getting 1.4 billion based on this many. Then we challenge and it dropped it a lot. There was no clawback from that allocation.
None. So, yeah, the general rule was 90% of the BEAD allocation was based upon the count of unserved locations based upon the FCC's map. They chose version 2 of the map. And lo and behold, version 3, the percent of unserved dropped by 15%. Version 4, it dropped by another 5%. So you have this continued deployment of carriers, but all the funding was based upon version 2, but they had no mechanism to reallocate or claw back any of those funds. They said anything that is in excess can be used for non-deployment funds. The non-deployment funds have to be projects that NTA approves. Louisiana was benefited by the fact that they got theirs in before the change of administration. We don't know what the administration will do, the new administration will do with those non-deployment project requests. And we're still not sure what the new administration is going to do with BEAD. We've heard all kinds of rumors. from putting a pause on BEAD, terminating BEAD, giving the BEAD money to Elon. There's all kinds of rumors going around. The safest one is these are obligated funds that went out to the states. The best path forward is to make it as successful as possible so that you can claim the credit. We'll see.
The challenge period for Louisiana, and is the challenge period over for most of the other states?
The challenge is over for all the states. I think for all now are done.
And does Louisiana's challenge look similar on a percentage basis from pre to post?
I think a lot of this, we've looked at a couple of states that are all pretty similar. I think we looked at Florida, actually. I think Florida had 300,000 or 400,000 pre. I think post, even just based upon excluding RDOF and federally funded, it was down to 150,000. So it's a pretty big drop in between pre and post. So. Yes, John.
So with RDOF, also applicants that won, but then did not fulfill the obligation of the build out. Is there some sort of protection now with BEAD
Yes.
for the state?
It depends on when the default occurs. So as we were running the Louisiana process, we had to reset everything up until the last moment because of these defaults. If they were approved by the FCC, they then came back as eligible locations in RDOF. If it wasn't approved by FCC in time, they're excluded from RDOF. So basically those locations are stranded because there's no BEAD money for them and the RDOF was defaulted. So Louisiana approached this, as I said, as a competitive process. They had 3 rounds, 2 really, and then the third one was kind of the cleanup round. In round 1, it was called by one of my associates that helped on this as the greed round. Basically, you came into this, if you bid on an area and no one else bid on that sub-project area or the collection of sub-project areas in your bid, you won. Because there was no one else bidding on it, you won. So what's the natural inclination in that concept is you go in as high as you can, because if there is a conflict, no matter what you bid, there's a second round and I can change my bid. So in round 1, the other thing that Louisiana was concerned about in the round 1 was, are we going to get participation? What are we going to see? How many of the locations will actually get a fiber bid? At the end of round 1, when we told them almost 98% of the locations in the state got a fiber bid. Many of them got multiple fiber bids. They're ecstatic. The problem was there's so many conflicts that dropped down significantly. But it was a positive sign. And at the end of round 1, the number that were awarded out, 19 BSLs. That was the number that didn't fall into a conflict, that the bidder came in with a unique collection of spas that no one else bid upon and they won. No one else. So 19. Yes.
Well, I wanted to know whether there were any rules of backing out if permissible, if numbers didn't make sense, as in the cited example of Comcast.
Where the, what was that?
Can you back out?
You cannot back out. Once you entered a bid in round 1, you were obligated to bid in round 2. And once you were bid in round 1, you're obligated to accept award if it came out.
Thank you.
There are potential to negotiate afterwards, but it's not part of the process. So I think Louisiana and other carriers will have to look at that. The issue for, if you look at these uncovered maps, if you look at the Charter footprint, the AT&T footprint, the Comcast footprint, some of these unserved locations are just noise. And the issue is the incumbent carrier wants to protect their footprint. So it's that concept, if you sell it out, will you then get an overbuilder into your footprint that now is going to deploy fiber where you can easily serve a coax? So do you accept the money or not? So it's a complex thing for the carriers to look through of how they want to go about that small bid.
Just as a follow-on question, can you give more color
So
on the
this
waiver?
is, generally the
The waivers.
competition for spas was quite high, which again was very encouraging for the state staff that ran the program. So now let me jump to actually the end results and a very confusing graph, but a very insightful graph, if I have to say so, because I came up with it. So this is the orange line that you see there is the cumulative amount of award provided out by percent of the BSLs awarded. So you got 0% at the end, and then here's 100% of the BSLs awarded. And this is the cumulative amount of award funding. The blue line is the CostQuest CapEx numbers that we provided to them. All the states have access to our capital estimates by location. They also have access to our net present value by location. So you can see our blue line on top, and then the green line is a reference funding amount that the state offered for that area. And the reason it's below is because the state assumed there'd be a match, that you would participate, that if you're willing to spend $1,500 per location passed, and the CapEx is $3,000, wouldn't you take 1,500? So that's the general concept of why this line is lower here. And then what happens is, and then let me finish up with whatever color line that is. In my PC, it's purple. Here, it's kind of a magenta, maybe. Yeah. This is the cumulative net present value. And the reason for BEAD is because we assume the cumulative net present value is negative and you need government funding. So in the end, yeah, we're negative. But you can see there's a lot of locations as we get up to about the 50th percentile. And we've estimated this across the country, that half of the locations eligible for BEAD actually have a positive business case. The issue is it positive enough? Does it reach the IRR thresholds that a company has? And that's part of the problem. Even though you may have a positive business case, it may not rank high enough for anybody who want to invest there because they have better uses of their funds elsewhere. Everyone has limited capital. This just helps encourage the deployment of those funds in certain areas. So you can see that at the 80th percentile, the amount of award was 301 million. The reference funding amount was 299, and our CapEx estimate was 314. We just called it an efficiency index of how well did the program do according to an independent source of how much money should be awarded out. We're at 96%. When we got to the 95th percentile, we're at 104%. It was that last percentile, or last 5 percentile. The investment required was 257 million as compared to our estimate of 100. And you might say, well, Jim, your numbers are wrong. The issue is if you look at this tail, this is exactly where Louisiana is allowing you to supply your gap books by account, so they don't have to go down to the receipt level. But you still have to have gap investment, CapEx, to get the funding. So it's a little odd in concept. I'll show you what happened here. If you're curious, if there's any curiosity about this bended knee or whatever you want to call it, that's where the satellite provider came in with their $10,000, and that's why you have that thing. Yeah, Gary.
I'm not sure this. If I said there's 80% of the areas you're going to build out, we could do $300 million.
Yeah.
And it's the 20% that you're spending $400 million.
It is. Yeah, which comes back to, I'll show you the chart, which is at what point does Starlink make sense or Kuiper make sense? The other question is, at what point does fixed wireless fit in? Because if you allow fiber up to a point, and then you say alternative technologies, typically at that point, Starlink is much more efficient than fixed wireless. So it's very difficult in this process here. For fixed wireless, they have a very small window. Because once you get up a certain threshold, even fixed wireless has a high cost. You have to get fiber out to the tower. You have to have radios that are dedicated for a density of 1 person per square mile. The efficiency of that is so low that the CapEx per customer is very high. So that's where a Starlink or Project Kuiper makes sense. Now, let me go to kind of Gary's question or concept is we arrayed the bids. This is the award per BSL. So a bid may have 1,000 BSLs in it. So that's why it's a lumpy graph. These are by bid, and we applied an average cost per BSL in that bid. So you had 30% of your bids come in under $2,000. You had, where's 4,000? Yeah, 60% come under 4,000. It's as you get out on this cost curve, these are awards that were made. You're awarding out $10,000 per location passed. I chopped off the tail end. The top point of this is $120,000. And I think that's where the new administration may come and provide some incentive to try and identify at what point do we think it's inefficient to spend that much money. This is the average award per BSL. So the first chart was by location. It was individually each award. This is as you move out, how does the average change? So again, you see at that 20 percentile, on average, it was about $1,000 per location passed. At 50%, it was about $1,500. And at 90%, you're at about $3,200. It's this tail, which is always the case with broadband funding. It's the hockey stick. The FCC has published multiple things we call hockey sticks, is that last 5, 10, 15% really escalate in cost, and really how do you want to fund them?
Can you talk to the low end of it? So am I reading that right? That 20% of the BSLs were under $1,000 per location. So those were underserved areas and not unserved, I'm assuming.
No, they could have been, most of them were unserved locations. They're just they're in high dense areas. These are like the areas where Comcast would have bid. These are areas in their footprint, adjacent to their footprint, that could have been easily served with low investment, but they weren't. And at some point, the cable company or the fiber company chose to stop. And it's those ones that are adjacent that really drive that lower portion. But if you look at our cost profile, there are across all the states, there are a collection of those that are sub $1,000 to build out. Yes, Gary.
I was just curious to know, how is the program monitored? Like, does someone from the program go out to inspect, to just make sure things are developing properly? And then are there any scenarios where someone might have to return money because they didn't meet the program requirements, or they started to build and ran out of money? Or have you seen, I know it's fairly new, I'm guessing, this particular assistance programs? And then also, when the service is deployed, are there any parameters in place to make sure that the carriers are delivering on quality?
So on the first and last part of the question, on kind of how do they track and monitor, in the NOFO, so the NTIA's Notice of Funding Opportunity, they laid out the audit and monitoring requirements. So there are extensive monitoring and audit requirements that each of the carriers, one, has to report back to the state each location that is now served and at what speed with technology, so that the state can monitor. And the state has a requirement to audit, so a random sample of selections in regards to, has it been deployed? So they'll send field forces out to examine if there are facilities out there. They will also do testing of speeds in that random selection. There are parties that are trying to collect speeds on every location deployed to make sure they match, but there is an audit requirement that they match per auditing rules. So to that question, as far as defaults, that's an issue that will have to be monitored as this process rolls along. We know in RDOF, there's many defaults that occurred. And the issue is what happens. There are parties that are looking to figure out how can we, back to the M&A question that came up this morning. Will there be parties out there that find these participants who are struggling and buy what they've done on the cheap and then finish out the program? Or will those things simply default and the money may not go back to the state? The state may get the assets that were built. So it's hard to tell. We'll have to see how it plays out.
Thank you.
In this chart, it's a repeat, but it shows the noise. So I showed you a nice smooth curve because it really looks good and it shows our data is really good. The actual bids were much noisier. This is a bid by, there's 18, I forget how many applications we received. But these are the bids by application. You can see many of them were above our number, but these are single unit BS or small areas that were bid. That's why it's like this and why it turns out. But the cost efficiency in round 2 was at 1.07. So again, we're happy with it. This chart was put together by a compatriot who looked at a treasury program, so the capital relief fund. The problem that we see in some programs is that if the program is run without knowledge of what to expect, is this $5,000 bid I got reasonable? If a state has no knowledge, how are they to judge the concept that it's reasonable before they provide the grant? In many of the treasury programs, the states issued requests for grants. The grants came in, they awarded. We took a state, their efficiency was we estimated the capital to be 98 million. They awarded out 205 million. To me, it just shows the value of just having some source to be informed as you run these programs, you achieve a much better result. So when you think about waste, fraud, and abuse, is this waste because they didn't monitor the program with additional information? I'm well over time. So this is just the impact of the 2-round bidding. So it just shows you that between rounds, the bid request came down 19%. So this was 142% of the reference funding amount. In round 2, they dropped down to an average of 115%. So that's why that first round is kind of the greed round. The second round is the fear round, and I'm going to be more aggressive in my bidding. We'll skip that. That's kind of, so I'll finish up with what the areas look like. Okay.
We got about 5-10 minutes.
Okay. This is what the results look like for the T-Mobile consortium. You can see that it was across the state. The lower portion was one member of the consortium. The upper portion was another member of the consortium. And T-Mobile's play is the wireless component of those bids. This is AT&T. AT&T's footprint in Louisiana is fairly large. They chose to focus their bids in certain areas. They had much larger bid profile, but the ones they won were over in the eastern portion of the state and up in the northern western portion. The next slides won't show much because they get more sporadic. Connexon. Connexon is a player that works with typically electric co-ops. They're the ISP on top of the local co-op network. You can see Connexon in RDOF was a big winner. They were a relatively smaller winner in Louisiana. ClearPath, again, small. A2D, I forget their brand name, just in actually 2 counties. And then Cajun, again, lower portion of the state. So that's just a quick run through of what happened in Louisiana. We view it as successful. Nevada posted their results. I think their average investment per BSL was around 8,000, if I recall correctly. We're going to try and monitor as best as we can
Any contact with Louisiana after the bidding process and other states reaching out to say, hey, you did it, you know, what did you learn from it? And can we build a better mousetrap for our state and process?
So we did present these results in November at a broadband leaders summit. So about 30 of the states came to it and we presented this just to walk through what we learned from it. So hopefully they pick up on some of that. The governor of Louisiana just sent to, can't think of his, the Commerce nominee, Lutnick, just sent a letter of, you should learn from what we've done as you think about going forward and modifying BEAD.
Jim, earlier on you talked about, when you just started, you talked about waivers. So I didn't understand what that was, and I just wanted you to add more color to the waivers. You talked about waivers surrounding all this.
Waivers? Yeah, the waivers are, there's multiple waivers in the NTIA BEAD process. You can file a waiver that a location that you won doesn't exist. If you can prove it doesn't exist, which means the fabric is at flaw, which doesn't ever happen for reference. But if the fabric was at flaw and identified a rock, a boat, whatever it may be, they can file a waiver and get that excluded from what they have to build out to. That's one type of waiver. Second waiver is they can file a waiver for the match portion. So BEAD, you're required to provide at least a 25% match unless you can file a waiver that shows that you can't, the area is so economically challenged that you can't match at 25%. So that's the second waiver. There's additional waivers that are in the program. I can't remember them all, but those are the two primary that I'm aware of.